Hi, my name is Erin George, and I'm excited to be participating in this year's Quoined Corner annual conference. Today, I'll be reading for you an essay I wrote last semester during my Race and American Literature course, titled Greed and Guidance in 1790s Philadelphian Literature. Charles Brockden Brown's novel, Arthur Mervyn, published in 1799, has been noted by scholars like James H. Justice as having something to say about the ideal American citizen. This underlying conversation could be seen as the answer to pertinent questions Brown raises about morality and the roots of corruption, using characters who fall from social status as a result of engaging in underhand activities. Meanwhile, the pamphlet, A Narrative of the Proceedings of the Black People During the Late Awful Calamity in Philadelphia, published in 1794 by Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, provides a responsive discussion on Black people's selflessness during the yellow fever epidemic. The pamphlet's accounts have since been deemed by scholars like Jacqueline Bacon and Derek Spires a reflection on compassion and citizenship, thus also containing implications for proper human conduct. These examples of unselfish assistance stand in stark contrast to the corruption portrayed in Brown's novel, as does Brown's titular character Arthur Mervyn. With this comparison and the time period in mind, it could be argued that Brown, Jones, and Allen used their works to offer a pertinent critique on slavery. They're analyzing the consequences of greed and suggesting a correct way of life, one in which other people are regarded higher than personal interest in the acquisition of wealth. Further, this interpretation may be crucial in accessing the larger cultural purpose behind both pieces of writing. Brown's novel tackles several topics, but the text's primary focus seems to be on wealth and its negative effects on behavior. The original owner of the money in Arthur Mervyn, Lodi Sr., is assassinated by an enslaved man he promises to free but sells along with his property. Brown, page 72, which shows early on how money stems from exploitation. The fact that Lodi is murdered as a result of his deception also hints at the possible negative consequences of greed, and this same currency circulates throughout the novel. Thomas Welbeck participates in the ensuing cycle of corruption when he uses Lodi Jr.'s money to construct a fake persona and build his own reputation, rather than giving it to Clemenza Lodi, who is its rightful inheritor. Brown, page 74. The Thetford brothers then perpetuate this trend by designing a way to swindle Welbeck and expose him as a fraud on page 33. Thus, money acts in the novel as a vector for carrying out immoral acts. This is not entirely different from its origins in the slave trade, where financial gain came as a direct result of Black people's pain and suffering. Because wealth was a primary motivating force behind slavery, it follows that this original corruption would be repeated in the hands of people more concerned with their own benefit than with the rights and happiness of others. This is especially true in Arthur Mervyn, given that the story's money begins with slavery in the Caribbean. The idea of wealth breeding corruption also relates to institutional racism, whereby racism is perpetuated through the economic systems put in place. The book Black Power, The Politics of Liberation in America, published in 1967, explains that, quote, racist attitudes and behavior can be held or expressed by individuals, but racist processes cannot. Processes are external to the individuals and can precede actors and agents who at a later stage will work within and with them. And this, end quote, from Turin Hamilton. This means any institution established on the foundation of racism is found to perpetuate racist practices and affect those who are in some way dependent on the process. The system of American capitalism could be seen as an example of this when contextualized by the aforementioned system of slavery. In the process of slavery, human rights were placed secondary to the interests of individual slaveholders and the larger United States economy, which generated both wealth and racism against Black people. The economic systems currently in place in the United States are thereby irrevocably linked to the slave trade and exemplify institutional racism in their operation. In Arthur Mervyn, Brown focuses more so on individuals and how their exploits regarding the acquisition and preservation of wealth lead them to morally gray decisions. Thomas Welbeck is a central example of this, as his pursuit of prosperity leads him to deception and theft. However, the money in the novel is also under the U.S. system of capitalism and cannot escape its connotations. The concept of institutional racism is not explicitly tackled in the novel, but since the wealth originates with the Caribbean slave trade, it could be reasoned that any money gained by slavery began in corruption and is thus destined to continue circulating in the same way. Therefore, to build a life around wealth is to build one based in corruption. This system thus operates in a way similar to that of institutional racism. With demoralization's origins in money and the slave trade being a major theme in the novel, it's surprising that the author would choose to tackle this subject through the lens of Arthur Mervyn, a character far removed from immoral motives. Mervyn, though unwittingly caught in between schemes, repeatedly proves himself to be built on unflinching morality. In fact, he seems to be situated right in the middle of these circumstances to represent Brown's ideals. For example, he is someone without a taste for material wealth, seeing it as secondary to personal development and the pursuit of knowledge. He states, quote, "I was able to discern the illusions of power and riches, and abjured every claim to esteem that was not founded on integrity." End quote. Brown 152. This demonstrates his dedication to gaining wisdom rather than reputation and wealth. He also establishes himself as someone with a critical eye towards social customs, such as when he takes up knitting despite it being an unusual hobby for men, explaining to his neighbor that he feels it to be, quote, "just as whimsical a business for a young woman," end quote, "as it is for a young man." Brown, page 179. Rather than following what society says he should be interested in, Arthur decides to listen to his own internal compass in all things. It is consistent, then, that he would show the same self-deference when it comes to money. His naivety may be also used as a means of disorienting the reader. Through Mervyn's eyes, the other character's adherence to monetary gain, stemming from slavery, and self-interest seems strange and unfamiliar. Their motives make less sense, which means attachment to practices rooted in the subjugation of others also makes less sense. The reader is instead encouraged to care for others and realize the ways they can be of use to and rely on other people. In this way, Mervyn represents what James Justice calls, quote, "the successful and moral American," end quote, found on page 304 of his book, who acts as an ideal for others living in the United States. Allen and Jones's pamphlet, a narrative of the proceedings of the black people during the late awful calamity in Philadelphia, also touches on this idea of the proper American by spotlighting the efforts of black people during the yellow fever epidemic. Rather than helping others with the aim of gaining compensation in return, many black Philadelphians at the time were willing to nurse the sick for free, seeing money as secondary to the care of others. For example, there are several stories included in the pamphlet of black people leaving the issue of payment up to those whose service they are in, or where they refuse payment altogether. One example given is that of a black woman who, upon discussion of how she could be incentivized to attend to a white man and his wife who had contracted the fever, gave an answer that could be regarded as unusual. Her reasoning for approaching the situation without pay was, quote, "I will not go for money. If I go for money, God will see it, and maybe make me take the disorder and die. But if I go and take no money, he may spare my life," end quote. Allen and Jones, page 37. This response demonstrates a belief that accepting payment for one's services is somehow not only distasteful, but chastised by God. This makes the decision on how to proceed a moral one. The woman reasons that if she helps without hope for compensation, which she reasons as the moral decision since it is favored by God, she will be rewarded by God with health. If she proceeds with upfront payment, which could be seen as the selfish decision, as it is seen as being disfavored by God, she will be punished with death. Thus, motivation for selflessly helping others comes from both compassion and a reflection on proper morality. In addition, the emphasis on punishment and death relates to the consequences of greed explored in Arthur Mervyn. Thomas Welbeck fears he will die as a consequence of his repeated deceit, and Lodi Sr. is murdered because of his. In the example of the woman in Allen and Jones's pamphlet, the same connection between selfishness and retribution is drawn. The inclusion of her story hence indicates that the authors believe the appropriate way to behave is unselfishly, and that to do otherwise may evoke negative consequences. Therefore, the examples they provide give the reader another set of ideals to follow. Jones and Allen further their argument by emphasizing the injustice of Matthew Carey's original pamphlet and its focus on money and, misinterpreted, greed. They reference how it was at first believed that black people were immune to the fever, an idea that was proven dangerously misguided when the deaths of black people began numbering those of whites, by exclaiming, quote, "Thus were our services extorted at the peril of our lives, yet you accuse us of extorting a little money from you." End quote. Allen and Jones, page 39. Carey and others' mention of money and perceived injustice at the hands of black people is thus pitted against the real humane acts that were performed by these same people despite the danger involved. In other words, concern about monetary gain is compared to the ideal moral action emphasized in the pamphlet, similarly to how Arthur Mervyn is compared to the corruption around him in Brown's novel. These actions could also be regarded as a form of citizenship, as argued by the author Derek Spires in his book, The Practice of Citizenship, Black Politics and Print Culture in the Early United States, where he, quote, reads neighborliness as a logic of civic responsibility that does not depend on money or familial relation, in recognition that a threat to the individual is, ultimately, a threat to all, end quote. From Barter, page 63. In other words, good citizenship is separate from personal interest. It was therefore exemplified by black Philadelphians of the time by their placement of other people over wealth and self-preservation. On how this point fits into the larger work of the pamphlet, an article of Jacqueline Bacon states, quote, Allen and Jones's authority to relate their actions depends upon the fact that, paradoxically, African Americans distinguished themselves during the epidemic because of their dedication to a common humanity, end quote. From Bacon, page 11. The authors, therefore, are justified in their defense of the black community's conduct during the epidemic because of the examples of selflessness they include. Their argument hinges on these demonstrations of morality, making it a key aspect in interpreting the work. It could be reasoned that Allen and Jones discouraged the idea of greed by analyzing how the effects of slavery have carried over into their present day. The authors acknowledge the lingering effects of slavery, including the mistreatment and devaluation of African Americans, stating, quote, we freely confess the vile habits often acquired in a state of servitude are not easily thrown off, end quote. Allen and Jones, page 42. This quote could imply that the selflessness spotlighted in the pamphlet could negatively tie back to slavery and a learned habit of black people not expecting their dues for hard work. This may be the case. However, it seems Jones and Allen are still attempting a larger idea and mention slavery here in order to do so, especially when thinking of institutional racism. I believe this is the author's way of bringing attention to the issues that still exist in American dynamics as a result of slavery, including the belief that black people do not make significant contributions to the community and that white people are somehow owed more money, which is the reason the authors open their pamphlet with a calculation of the money they have received to handle the deceased. Thus, the vile habits Jones and Allen mention could alternatively reference those picked up by white Americans in service of the institution of slavery. The yellow fever epidemic and the city of Philadelphia are the background for this bigger argument because these two contexts brought people's instinct towards self-preservation to light. At this time, Philadelphia could be described as, quote, the country's political, economic, and medical epicenter, end quote, as well as the largest city in the United States, information from Gamble. This indicates the city could be seen as reflective of the attitudes of the rest of the U.S. It also gives authors who utilize the setting more ammunition, since Philadelphia's intimate ties to wealth make it fitting for arguments regarding the effects of capital and excess. An article discussing a narrative on the proceedings, as well as other documents published around the same time, says the following of its sources, quote, as the authors interpret it, the yellow fever is a judgment on the people of Philadelphia for their indulgence in luxury, end quote, from Ostrowski, page 15. This idea of luxury is a central focus of Arthur Mervyn, in which the glamour and showiness of the city is sharply contrasted to the country, where Mervyn is originally from. While the epidemic is covered in less detail, the worship of opulence can be observed through characters like Lodi Sr. and Welbeck, who care about reputation and wealth so much that they are willing to lie to others to obtain them. Allen and Jones's account also provides an effective contrast between selfishness and what it means to have virtue through consideration for others. Thus, the epidemic and the customs of the city are utilized to convey the larger idea of moral corruption and set up the possibility of an alternative. This idea of how the setting of Philadelphia influenced writing of the time has been supported by scholars like Philip Gould. His article, Race, Commerce, and the Literature of Yellow Fever in Early National Philadelphia, states, quote, "The extreme effects of urban and commercial life in Philadelphia make it an intriguing site for considering the literature of the epidemic as a set of cultural responses to social change," end quote, found on page 160. He goes on to explain how these cultural responses entailed a redefinition of virtue and citizenship, motivated by changes in the economy. This is exactly what I believe Brown, Jones, and Allen are trying to illustrate through their texts. Given the effects the yellow fever epidemic had on both the economy and public health, it follows that there would be resulting change concerning behavior and thus a commentary on that shift. In this case, the author's comments discourage the trend towards self-preservation and an overemphasis on the economy, reminding the reader of how this mindset contributed to the slave trade, as well as the subsequent racism inherent in the wider process of wealth acquisition. Thank you for letting me read my paper today, and I will be listing my works cited separately.